June 6, 1944. The world holds its breath as the most ambitious military operation in history begins. The beaches of Normandy are about to become the crucible where the fate of Europe will be decided. As the first light of dawn breaks over the churning English Channel, thousands of American soldiers are packed tightly into landing craft, their faces set with grim determination. Their destination, Omaha Beach, a name that, by the end of this day, will be forever etched into the annals of history as a symbol of courage, chaos, and unimaginable sacrifice. The ramps drop. Instantly, the air is torn apart by the staccato roar of machine guns. Within moments, the sand is stained red. Men are cut down before they even reach the water's edge. The air is thick with smoke, with screams, with the relentless hammering of German guns. Bodies pile up on the tide line. The plan had been for tanks to lead the way, smashing through obstacles and silencing bunkers. But the tanks are nowhere to be seen. Most have sunk before even reaching the shore, swallowed by the merciless sea. The infantry is left exposed, pinned down, and dying by the hundreds. But just 3 miles away, on another stretch of sand called Gold Beach, a very different scene is unfolding. British soldiers step onto the shore, not without danger, but with a sense of order and momentum. They're not being slaughtered in droves. They're advancing, pushing past obstacles, clearing mines, and knocking out German bunkers with a speed that seems almost surreal. The difference is so stark, so immediate, that it almost defies belief. How can two beaches, so close together, tell such different stories on the same day, against the same enemy? The answer isn't just in the men or the plans. It's in the machines rolling up behind the British troops. Machines that look like something out of a madman's sketchbook. Tanks with giant spinning chains, flinging debris and detonating mines. Armored vehicles spitting fire, clearing bunkers with sheets of flame. Massive steel beasts laying down bridges, filling in craters, and rolling over obstacles that would have stopped any normal tank dead in its tracks. To the Germans, it must have looked like the British had unleashed a circus of mechanical monsters. To the men on the ground, these machines were nothing short of a miracle. But here's the twist: these bizarre inventions, these so-called funnies, were the brainchild of a man the British Army had once thrown out in disgrace. A man so difficult, so stubborn, and so obsessed with doing things differently that his own commanders had forced him into retirement. His name was Percy Hobart, and he was about to become the most unlikely hero of D-Day. For years, Hobart's ideas had been dismissed as lunacy. Tanks that could swim, vehicles that could breathe fire or lay their own roads. The military establishment laughed him out of the room. But on this day, as British and Canadian troops surged forward while Americans were being cut down, the laughter stopped. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know, who was this eccentric general, and how had his wild inventions turned the tide of the most important battle of the war? The story of D-Day is usually told as a tale of bravery, sacrifice, and overwhelming odds. But there's another side, a hidden story of innovation, stubbornness, and the price of ignoring genius. Because while American commanders clung to tradition and paid for it in blood, the British put their faith in a man everyone else thought was mad. And that decision saved thousands of lives. This story doesn't begin on the beaches of Normandy. It starts years earlier, in the quiet English countryside, where a disgraced general was spending his days as a farm guard, sketching out ideas that would one day change the course of history. It's a story of how one man's refusal to accept impossible became the secret weapon of D-Day. And it's a story that raises a haunting question. How many lives could have been saved if more people had listened? As the sun rose over Normandy, the fate of thousands hung in the balance, not just on the courage of the men storming the beaches, but on the inventions of a man who refused to give up, even when everyone told him he was wrong. The difference between Omaha and Gold Beach wasn't just luck or planning. It was the result of a battle fought long before D-Day. A battle of ideas, of innovation versus tradition, of one stubborn genius against the entire military establishment. So, what exactly were these strange machines? Who was the man behind them? And why did the Americans refuse the very inventions that could have saved so many of their own? The answers are as fascinating as they are tragic, because the story of Percy Hobart and his funnies isn't just a footnote in history. It's a lesson in the cost of ignoring the unconventional and the power of believing in the impossible. But before we dive into the wild world of swimming tanks and flame-throwing monsters, let's rewind the clock. Let's meet the man who would become D-Day's secret weapon. A man whose journey from disgrace to redemption would change the face of modern warfare forever. Before the world ever heard the name, Hobart's funnies. Before tanks floated or breathed fire, there was just Percy Hobart. A man who, by all accounts, was never meant to be ordinary. Born in 1885 in the shadow of the Himalayas, in a remote corner of British India, Hobart was the son of a colonial administrator. From the start, he was surrounded by the rigid traditions and expectations of the British Empire. But even as a boy, Percy was different. He was restless, endlessly curious, and, as his teachers would later say, impossible to manage. Rules were things to be questioned, not followed blindly. By the time he entered the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, Hobart had already developed a reputation for brilliance and for being a thorn in the side of authority. He was the kind of cadet who would ace the engineering exams, then argue with the instructors about why the curriculum was outdated. When he was commissioned into the Royal Engineers in 1904, the British Army was still clinging to the traditions of the 19th century. Cavalry charges, red tunics, and the belief that wars were won by sheer force of will. But Hobart saw the world differently. He saw the future in machines, in innovation, in the relentless march of technology. World War I was his crucible. The mud-choked trenches of France, the endless artillery barrages, the senseless slaughter. Hobart witnessed it all. But what fascinated him most was the arrival of a new weapon, the tank. These lumbering, smoke-belching monsters were crude, unreliable, and often as dangerous to their crews as to the enemy. But Hobart saw their potential. He transferred to the fledgling tank corps in 1916, just as these armored beasts were making their battlefield debut. While others dismissed tanks as a passing fad, Hobart became obsessed. He studied every breakdown, every failure, every tiny success. He believed that tanks could change the very nature of warfare. If only someone was willing to rethink everything. Between the wars, Hobart became one of Britain's leading theorists on armoured warfare. He wrote papers, gave lectures, and argued, loudly and often, that the future belonged to fast, mobile tank formations, not slow-moving infantry or static defences. He pushed for new tactics, new training, new ways of thinking. But the British Army, still haunted by the horrors of the last war, wanted nothing to do with radical change. Senior officers saw Hobart as a troublemaker, a man who refused to know his place. His intolerance for incompetence was legendary. He would publicly call out superiors for clinging to outdated ideas, sometimes in front of their own men. He had no patience for mediocrity, and even less for bureaucracy. By the late 1930s, as the world edged closer to another global conflict, Hobart's reputation was both his greatest asset and his biggest liability. He was respected by a handful of forward-thinking officers, but despised by the old guard. His ideas were too disruptive, his personality too abrasive. In 1939, just as Hitler's armies were rolling across Europe, the British Army made its decision. Hobart was forced into retirement. The official reason was difficult to work with. The real reason was far simpler. He was right too often, and too many powerful men resented being told their methods were obsolete. Imagine the humiliation. One of Britain's most brilliant armoured warfare experts, a man who had commanded entire divisions, was suddenly stripped of his rank and sent home. No fanfare, no thanks, just a quiet exit. Hobart found himself in the English countryside, working as a corporal in the Home Guard, the civilian defence force made up of old men and boys too young for the regular army. To make ends meet, he took a job as a guard on his brother-in-law's farm in Chipping-Campden, Gloucestershire. The man who had once shaped the future of British armour was now spending his days watching over cows and chickens. But here's where the story takes a turn. Most men, faced with such disgrace, would have faded into obscurity. They would have nursed their wounds, complained about injustice, and let the world pass them by. Not Percy Hobart. Instead, he turned his exile into a laboratory. In a cramped farmhouse office, surrounded by stacks of engineering books and piles of scrap paper, Hobart began to sketch. He drew tanks with strange attachments, vehicles with odd shapes and outlandish features. He filled notebook after notebook with ideas, some practical, some bordering on the fantastical. He was obsessed with one problem above all: how to break through a heavily defended beach. The memory of Gallipoli haunted him. The disastrous World War I campaign, where Allied troops were slaughtered trying to storm fortified Turkish positions from the sea. Hobart knew that if Britain ever had to invade German-occupied Europe, the cost in lives would be catastrophic unless someone found a better way. So he started designing solutions. Tanks that could swim ashore under their own power, protected from enemy fire. Tanks equipped with flamethrowers to clear out bunkers and trenches. Tanks that could lay bridges, fill in craters, or clear minefields with spinning chains. Each idea was more radical than the last. To outsiders, it looked like madness. Who would listen to a disgraced general, tinkering with toy models and wild blueprints in a farmhouse? Hobart had no official position, no resources, no authority, but he had something far more important: conviction. He knew he was right. He knew that the old ways would get men killed, and he refused to let go of his vision, no matter how many doors were slammed in his face. His wife, Dorothy, watched as he poured every ounce of energy into his designs. She later recalled, "He was never bitter, never defeated. He just kept working, kept thinking, kept believing that someone would listen." Eventually, Hobart's friends and family worried about him. Some thought he was losing his mind. Others saw a man more alive than ever, driven by a sense of purpose that no amount of humiliation could extinguish. Meanwhile, the world outside was changing fast. The German blitzkrieg had shattered the myth of static defenses. Tanks, used with speed and imagination, were rewriting the rules of war. But back in Britain, the military establishment clung to its old ways, blind to the revolution happening right before their eyes. Hobart watched in frustration as opportunities were missed, as lives were wasted, as the same mistakes were made over and over again. Yet, even in exile, his reputation couldn't be completely erased. Whispers about "mad general" and his wild ideas began to circulate. Some younger officers, frustrated by the army's conservatism, they sought him out for advice. They found a man who was demanding, impatient, and utterly uncompromising, but also brilliant, generous with his knowledge, and fiercely committed to saving lives. Hobart's story is a reminder that genius is rarely comfortable or easy to live with. He was difficult, yes. He was stubborn, absolutely. But he was also a visionary, a man who saw the future more clearly than anyone around him. And while the army tried to forget him, Hobart was quietly preparing for the day when his ideas would finally be needed. That day was coming faster than anyone realized, because in the darkest days of 1940, as Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine, a new leader would rise. One who valued results over reputation, and who was willing to take a chance on the most unlikely of heroes. Winston Churchill was no stranger to controversy. He had been written off as a political has-been more than once, only to return when his country needed him most. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the value of unconventional thinking. So when he asked his military advisors about Percy Hobart, the brilliant, abrasive, and recently disgraced tank commander, he wasn't looking for a polite answer. He wanted results. The exchange was brief but telling. "What happened to Hobart?" Churchill demanded. The reply was awkward. "He was forced to retire, sir." "Personality issues?" Churchill's response was pure Churchill. "I don't care about his personality. Can he design and command armored forces?" The answer, of course, was yes. "Then bring him back," Churchill ordered. "We're fighting for our survival, not running a social club." It was a decision that would change the course of the war, and the life of Percy Hobart. Forever, the telegram arrived at Hobart's farmhouse on a cold November morning. It was short and to the point. "Report to the War Office immediately." For a moment, Hobart could hardly believe it. After months of obscurity, after being written off by the very institution he had served for decades, he was being called back, not just as an advisor, but as a commander. The man who had been guarding cows and chickens was about to be handed one of the most important jobs in the British Army. Churchill didn't just recall Hobart to service. He gave him a blank slate and a monumental challenge: create and command the 11th Armored Division from scratch. Britain desperately needed modern armored forces, and Hobart was one of the few men who truly understood how to build them. But this was no easy task. The division was a patchwork of inexperienced units and raw recruits and outdated equipment. Morale was low, and the shadow of recent defeats hung over everything. Hobart attacked the problem with his trademark intensity. He was demanding, perfectionist, and utterly intolerant of mediocrity. Officers who couldn't meet his standards were replaced without hesitation. Tactics that didn't work were scrapped, no matter how many feathers were ruffled. He trained his division relentlessly in mobile warfare, combined arms operations, and rapid exploitation. Every exercise was a test, every failure a lesson. Under Hobart's command, the 11th Armored Division was transformed from a ragtag collection of units into one of Britain's elite fighting forces. But even as he whipped his new division into shape, Hobart's mind was never far from his true obsession, the problem of the fortified beach. He knew that sooner or later the Allies would have to launch an amphibious assault on German-occupied Europe. And he knew, with a certainty born of bitter experience, that conventional tactics would lead to disaster. So, in his spare time, he continued to develop his wild ideas, sketching, designing, and refining the machines that would one day become known as Hobart's Funnies. By 1942, Hobart had detailed designs for several revolutionary vehicles. The duplex drive DD tank was perhaps the most audacious, a conventional tank fitted with a collapsible canvas screen and propellers, allowing it to float and swim, ashore under its own power. To most observers, the idea seemed insane. How could a 30-ton steel monster possibly float on a flimsy canvas skirt? But Hobart's engineering calculations were meticulous, and his confidence was unshakable. Then there was the flail tank, a vehicle with a rotating drum mounted on the front, covered in heavy chains. As the drum spun, the chains would beat the ground ahead of the tank, detonating mines before they could harm the crew or following infantry. It looked ridiculous, but it solved a deadly problem: how to clear paths through minefields without sacrificing men. Other designs were equally radical. The Fascine tank carried huge bundles of wood and debris, which could be dropped into wide ditches or craters to create instant bridges. The AVRE's, Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers, was a Churchill tank modified to carry a massive demolition charge launcher, capable of destroying concrete bunkers at close range. Each invention addressed a specific tactical challenge. Each was a solution to a problem that conventional thinking had failed to solve. Most British officers who saw Hobart's sketches thought he had lost his mind. The army was already struggling to produce enough conventional tanks for the battles in North Africa. Why waste precious resources on these bizarre contraptions? But Hobart was undeterred. He knew that the real test was still to come. The day would arrive when the Allies would have to storm the beaches of France, and when that day came, his machines would be ready. In 1943, as Allied planning for the invasion of France began in earnest, the need for innovation became impossible to ignore. Amphibious assaults against fortified positions were notoriously costly. The Germans had spent years building the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of bunkers, minefields, and obstacles designed to make any landing a massacre. Without some way to overcome these defenses quickly, The invasion could fail with catastrophic casualties. General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, remembered Hobart's specialized tank concepts. In March 1943, he recalled Hobart once again, this time to command the 79th Armored Division. But this would not be a conventional armored division. Instead, Hobart was given a unique mandate: develop and deploy his specialized vehicles specifically for the D-Day invasion. For the first time, Hobart had the resources, the engineers, and the authority to turn his wildest ideas into reality. The 79th Armored Division became a workshop of innovation, a place where the impossible was not just considered, but expected. Tanks were modified, tested, and modified again. Engineers worked around the clock, building prototypes, running trials, and solving problems that had stumped the best minds in the army. The other officers called them Hobart's funnies, a term meant to mock, but which Hobart wore as a badge of honor. The vehicles looked funny, ungainly, and strange. But Hobart didn't care about aesthetics. He cared about results. Every one of his funnies addressed a specific tactical challenge the invasion would face. Swimming tanks to get armor ashore with the first wave, flail tanks to clear mines, AVRs to destroy bunkers, bridging tanks to cross ditches and craters. Each machine was a tool, designed for a job that no conventional tank could do. By the spring of 1944, Hobart had working prototypes of multiple specialized vehicles. They had been tested extensively in conditions simulating the Normandy beaches. They worked. The question was, would they be used? In January 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander for the D-Day invasion, was briefed on Hobart's specialized vehicles. Demonstrations were arranged. American and British officers watched as DD tanks swam across a lake, flail tanks cleared mock minefields, and AVRs destroyed concrete bunkers. The British were enthusiastic. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding British ground forces, immediately ordered Hobart's funnies to be assigned to all British and Canadian landing beaches: Gold, Juno, and Sword. But the American response was mixed. Some officers were impressed, others deeply skeptical. The vehicles looked strange, were untested in actual combat, and seemed overly complicated. American doctrine emphasized straightforward, overwhelming force, not elaborate technical solutions. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, which would assault Omaha and Utah beaches, was particularly skeptical of the DD swimming tanks. "Those canvas screens look flimsy as hell," he told Eisenhower. "What if they tear in rough seas? We'd lose the tanks before they even reach shore. I think our boys are better off with conventional landing craft." Eisenhower was torn. He respected both British innovation and American pragmatism. In the end, he made a compromise. American forces would receive DD swimming tanks, after much British insistence, but would not receive the other specialized vehicles, the flail tanks, AVREs, or other funnies. American commanders would rely on naval gunfire, air bombardment, and infantry courage to overcome beach defenses. Hobart was horrified by this decision. He had designed the funnies as a complete system, each vehicle addressing a different obstacle. Swimming tanks would get armor ashore quickly, but they still needed flails to clear mines, AVRs to destroy bunkers, fascines to cross ditches. Taking only the DD tanks while rejecting the others was, in Hobart's words, like bringing an umbrella but no raincoat. Helpful, but insufficient. He warned his staff, "Those American boys are going to die unnecessarily. They're brave, well-trained, well-equipped, but they're going to hit those beaches without the tools they need to overcome German defenses. It's going to be bloody." But Hobart had no authority over American forces. All he could do was ensure that British and Canadian troops had his funnies, and hope that the vehicles would prove themselves in combat. If they worked spectacularly at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, maybe, just maybe, American commanders would reconsider for future operations. But for now, the stage was set. The machines were ready. The fate of thousands would soon hang on the inventions of a man who had been written off as mad. On the night before D-Day, June 5, 1944, Hobart wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we'll know if 20 years of thinking about armored warfare was worth anything. Tomorrow my funnies either save lives or prove me a fool. God be with our boys." He was 58 years old, twice recalled from disgraceful retirement, about to find out if his life's work, the strange tanks everyone called crazy, would actually work in the most important battle of the war. The world was about to witness the ultimate test of innovation versus tradition, of imagination versus skepticism. And as the first light of dawn crept over the beaches of Normandy, the answer was only hours away. The spring of 1944 was a season of secrets and suspense. Across southern England, the fields and hedgerows were alive with the rumble of tanks, the clatter of engineers, and the whispered rumors of an invasion that would change the world. The Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, the code name for the largest amphibious assault in history. Every detail was shrouded in secrecy, every plan rehearsed to exhaustion. But beneath the surface, a quiet battle was raging. A battle not of guns and bombs, but of ideas. At the heart of this struggle stood Percy Hobart and his 79th Armored Division. Their base was a hive of activity, a place where the impossible was being made real. Engineers worked around the clock, welding, testing, and refining machines that looked more like science fiction than military hardware. There were tanks with giant spinning flails, designed to clear deadly minefields. There were vehicles with collapsible canvas screens, ready to swim ashore under their own power. There were armored behemoths carrying bridges, flamethrowers, and demolition mortars. Each one was a solution to a problem that had haunted military planners for decades. But not everyone was convinced. For every officer who saw genius in Hobart's inventions, there was another who saw only folly. The British, battered by years of war and desperate for any edge, were willing to take a chance. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the famously demanding commander of British ground forces, was quick to see the value in Hobart's funnies. He ordered them assigned to every British and Canadian landing beach, Gold, Juno, and Sword. "We need every advantage we can get," Montgomery declared. "If these machines work, they'll save lives. If they don't, we'll know soon enough." The Americans, by contrast, were more cautious. Their doctrine was built on overwhelming firepower, straightforward tactics, and the belief that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. To many American commanders, Hobart's funnies seemed like a distraction, unproven, untested, and potentially unreliable. General Omar Bradley, tasked with leading the assault on Omaha and Utah beaches, was particularly skeptical. He watched the demonstrations with a critical eye, noting every flaw, every potential point of failure. "We don't need gimmicks," he told his staff. "We need tanks that work, not circus acts." The tension between innovation and tradition was palpable. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, found himself caught in the middle. He respected British ingenuity, but he also understood the American preference for simplicity and reliability. In the end, he made a compromise. The Americans would accept the DD's duplex drive, swimming tanks, but they would reject the rest of Hobart's specialized vehicles. No flail tanks to clear mines, no VRAs to demolish bunkers, no bridge layers or fascine carriers. The Americans would rely on naval gunfire, air bombardment, and the raw courage of their infantry to break through the German defenses. It was a decision that would have consequences far beyond the planning rooms of southern England. As D-Day approached, the final rehearsals took on a feverish intensity. On the British and Canadian beaches, crews drilled with their funnies, learning to operate the complex machinery under fire. They practiced launching DD tanks from landing craft, deploying flails to clear simulated minefields, and using AVRs to blast through mock bunkers. Every exercise was a test, every failure a lesson. Hobart himself was a constant presence, moving from unit to unit, offering advice, demanding perfection, and reminding everyone of the stakes. "These machines are not toys," he told his men. "They are the difference between life and death." On the American side, the mood was different. The focus was on firepower and speed. Infantry units practiced storming the beaches under cover of massive bombardments. Tank crews prepared to land in conventional landing craft, ready to fight their way ashore. There was confidence, even optimism, that the sheer weight of the assault would carry the day. But there were also quiet doubts. Whispers about the strength of the German defenses, the effectiveness of the preliminary bombardment, and the risks of attacking without specialized support. The Germans, for their part, were ready. Years of labor had gone into the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of bunkers, pillboxes, minefields, and obstacles designed to make any landing a nightmare. Machine guns were sighted to create killing zones across the beaches. Artillery was hidden in reinforced emplacements. Barbed wire, steel hedgehogs, and anti-tank ditches waited to trap and destroy any vehicle that made it ashore. The defenders were confident that they could hold the line, at least long enough to throw the invaders back into the sea. The night before the invasion, as thousands of soldiers prepared for battle, Hobart sat in his quarters, writing in his diary. "Tomorrow we'll know if 20 years of thinking about armored warfare was worth anything. Tomorrow my funnies either save lives or prove me a fool. God be with our boys." It was a moment of quiet reflection, but also of steely resolve. Hobart knew that the fate of his inventions, and the lives of thousands, would be decided in the first hours of the assault. Section 9, the Crucible of Normandy. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the invasion began. The first waves of landing craft surged toward the beaches, packed with men, tanks, and equipment. On Gold, Juno, and Sword, the funnies led the way. DD tanks launched from their landing craft, floating on their canvas screens, propellers churning through the choppy surf. Flail tanks followed, their spinning chains detonating mines in spectacular bursts of sand and smoke. AVIs moved forward, their massive mortars ready to blast through concrete bunkers. Bridge, layers and fascine carriers filled in ditches and craters, creating paths for the following waves. The effect was immediate and dramatic. German defenders, expecting to hold the beaches for hours, were stunned to see tanks arriving with the first wave of infantry. Machine gun nests and pillboxes that should have been impregnable were destroyed by direct hits from AVRs. Minefields that should have slowed the advance to a crawl were cleared in minutes by the flails. Obstacles that should have trapped vehicles and men were swept aside by the specialized equipment. Within 2 hours, British and Canadian forces had penetrated inland, secured their objectives, and were advancing on schedule, with casualties far lower than anyone had dared hope. At Omaha Beach, the story was very different. The plan had called for DD tanks to lead the assault, one of the few Hobart innovations the Americans had accepted. But crucial decisions went wrong. The sea was rough, waves 4 to 5 feet high. British DD tank commanders at Gold Beach had made a critical judgment: launch the tanks closer to shore, around 1,000 yards out, to reduce the risk of foundering. At Omaha, American commanders stuck to the original plan, launching the tanks 5,000 to 6,000 yards offshore despite the rough conditions. The result was catastrophic. Of 32 DD tanks launched, 27 sank within minutes, their canvas screens overwhelmed by the waves. Crews drowned or were rescued by accompanying vessels. Only 5 tanks reached the shore. Without the immediate fire support the DD tanks were supposed to provide, the American infantry hit Omaha Beach virtually alone. The preliminary bombardment had largely missed the German positions. Naval gunfire was lifting to avoid hitting the landing craft. The German defenses were intact. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery creating killing zones across the sand. The first waves were slaughtered. Men were hit before they even left the landing craft. Bodies piled up on the beach. Wounded men drowned in the surf. Units lost cohesion. Communications broke down. Within the first hour, over 1,000 American soldiers were casualties, and the beach was gridlocked with dead, wounded, and pinned down troops. And critically, there were no flail tanks to clear paths through the minefields, no AVRs to destroy bunkers, no specialized bridging equipment to cross obstacles. The American soldiers faced the full fury of the Atlantic Wall with only their personal weapons, their courage, and their determination. It was enough, barely. Individual acts of heroism, small groups of men flanking positions, destroyers risking grounding to provide close fire support, and sheer stubborn refusal to fail eventually broke the German defenses. But it took hours, cost roughly 2,000 American casualties on June 6 alone, and came terrifyingly close to complete failure. Historians would later analyze the carnage at Omaha Beach and reach a sobering conclusion. Hobart's specialized vehicles, particularly the flail tanks and AVREs, would have dramatically reduced casualties and sped the advance. The very obstacles that caused such difficulty at Omaha, mines, bunkers, anti-tank ditches, were exactly what Hobart's funnies were designed to defeat. At the British and Canadian beaches, where the funnies were used extensively, Day casualties were roughly 50% lower than at Omaha Beach, despite facing similar German defenses. The difference wasn't courage. The American soldiers were as brave as any who ever fought. The difference was tools. The British and Canadians had specialized equipment designed for the specific problems they would face. The Americans at Omaha did not. Back in England, as reports filtered in from the beaches, Hobart experienced a mix of pride and pain. Each message describing the success of his funnies was gratifying. Each report from Omaha, where his innovations had been rejected, was a bitter reminder of what might have been. He wrote in his diary, "Brave men died today because we gave them an impossible job without the proper tools. We knew how to solve those problems. We built the machines to solve them. And we let pride and skepticism keep us from sharing those solutions. God forgive us." The aftermath of D-Day was impossible to ignore. Within days, American commanders were requesting Hobart's specialized vehicles. The difference between the British and Canadian beaches, where the funnies had been used, and Omaha Beach, where they had not, was too stark to dismiss. General Bradley, who had once been skeptical, sent a direct request. "Can we get some of those specialized British tanks? The flails especially. We're hitting minefields that are costing us tanks and men." Hobart's response was gracious, despite having every right to say, "I told you so." He began transferring flail tanks and training American crews immediately. "We should have insisted more strongly that you take them from the start," he told his staff. The Americans, now convinced by the evidence of their own eyes, embraced the funnies with a new sense of urgency. The D-Day test was over. The verdict was clear. Innovation had triumphed over tradition, not in the planning rooms, but on the blood-soaked sands of Normandy. The machines that had once been mocked as mad had saved thousands of lives, and the man who had refused to accept impossible had been vindicated in the most dramatic way imaginable. But for Hobart, the real test was just beginning. The war was far from over, and every new obstacle would demand a new solution. The funnies had proven their worth, but the battle for innovation was never truly finished. As the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, Hobart's relentless drive to solve the next problem would shape the outcome of the war and the future of military engineering. The dust of D-Day had barely settled when the true impact of Hobart's funnies began to ripple across the Allied armies. The contrast between the British and Canadian beaches, where the funnies had led the way, and Omaha Beach, where they had been largely absent, was too stark to ignore. The numbers told a story that no one could spin at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Casualties were dramatically lower, objectives were secured faster, and the advance inland was smoother. At Omaha, the price of skepticism was measured in blood and lost time. For the American commanders, the lesson was immediate and humbling. Within days of the landings, requests for Hobart's specialized vehicles flooded in. General Omaha Bradley, who had once dismissed the funnies as unnecessary, now sent urgent messages to British headquarters. "Can we get some of those specialized tanks? The flails especially. We're hitting minefields that are costing us tanks and men." The tone had shifted from skepticism to desperation. The Americans needed solutions, and they needed them fast. Hobart, ever the professional, responded without a trace of bitterness. He could have said, "I told you so." Instead, he mobilized his division to begin transferring flail tanks and other specialized vehicles to American units. British crews trained their American counterparts in crash courses, sometimes right on the front lines. The learning curve was steep, but the results were immediate. Where flail tanks led, casualty rates from mines plummeted. Where aviaries attacked, bunkers that would have required costly infantry assaults were reduced to rubble in minutes. The funnies, once mocked as impractical, became the most sought-after tools in the Allied arsenal. The Normandy campaign quickly became a proving ground for Hobart's inventions. The hedgerows of France, thick with mines and booby traps, were a nightmare for conventional armor. But the funnies turned obstacles into opportunities. Flail tanks cleared paths through fields that would have taken days and dozens of lives to cross. Laying tanks spanned rivers and craters, keeping the advance moving. Crocodile flamethrower tanks, with their terrifying jets of fire, cleared enemy trenches and bunkers with a psychological impact that no conventional weapon could match. German soldiers, who had been trained to fight to the last man, surrendered in droves rather than face the crocodile's flames. The impact was not just tactical, but strategic. The speed and efficiency with which the Allies advanced through Normandy stunned the German high command. Every time the Germans created a new obstacle, minefields, anti-tank ditches, fortified villages, Hobart's funnies found a way through. The 79th Armored Division became the spearhead of innovation, its vehicles leading assaults, clearing the way for infantry and conventional armor, and solving problems that had stymied planners for years. As the Allies pushed eastward, the funnies continued to evolve. Hobart was never satisfied with what he had already achieved. Every new challenge was met with a new solution. When the Allies reached the formidable Siegfried Line, the German Western Defensive Wall, Hobart's team developed new variants. Conga, explosive devices to blast through dragons' teeth, modified aviaries with even larger demolition charges, and mine plows that could clear paths faster than flails in certain terrain. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 was a showcase of Hobart's vision. DD tanks swam across the river, Buffalo amphibious carriers ferried infantry, and specialized bridging tanks laid spans in hours rather than days. German defenders, who had counted on the Rhine to slow the Allied advance, were overwhelmed by the speed and ingenuity of the assault. The funnies were no longer a British curiosity. American, Canadian, and Free French forces all adopted variants of Hobart's designs. Engineers from across the Allied armies visited the 79th Armored Division, taking notes, sketching blueprints, and learning from the men who had turned the impossible into the routine. The vehicles that had once been dismissed as mad were now the gold standard for overcoming obstacles. But the impact of Hobart's funnies went beyond the battlefield. They changed the very way armies thought about war. For decades, military doctrine had been built on the idea that courage and firepower could overcome any obstacle. Hobart proved that the right tool, designed for a specific problem, could save lives, speed victory, and turn the tide of battle. His approach was systematic: identify the obstacle, design a solution, and refuse to accept that anything was impossible. It was a philosophy that resonated far beyond the beaches of Normandy. The numbers were staggering. Even conservative estimates suggested that Hobart's inventions had saved thousands of lives on D-Day alone. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, D-Day casualties were roughly 3,000, compared to 2,000 at Omaha Beach alone, a single beach without most funnies. Statistical analysis suggested that if Omaha had been assaulted with the full range of Hobart's vehicles, casualties might have been 60 to 70% lower. Beyond D-Day, the ongoing use of specialized vehicles prevented casualties throughout the European campaign. Flail tanks cleared minefields that would have cost hundreds of infantry lives. AVRs destroyed bunkers from a distance, sparing men from deadly close-quarters assaults. Bridging equipment allowed rapid advances, keeping units from being pinned down and exposed to enemy fire. But behind the statistics were real people, soldiers who survived because of a flail tank, a bridge, layer, or a crocodile. Sergeant Thomas Grant, a British tank commander, wrote home in July 1944, "Today, our flail tank cleared a path through a German minefield. Would have taken infantry hours to clear it with men dying every step. Instead, we did it in 20 minutes and nobody got hurt. These strange-looking tanks everyone laughed at are saving our lives every day." Private William Murphy, an American soldier whose unit received flail tanks in late June, wrote, "I don't know who designed these weird machines, but I want to shake his hand. Yesterday, one of them cleared mines ahead of us. Without it, I'd probably be dead right now. Whoever built this thing, he's a genius." For Hobart, these stories were the real measure of success. He had never cared much for medals or recognition. What mattered to him was the lives saved, the men who came home, the families who were spared the knock on the door. Every soldier who survived because of a funny was a vindication of years of ridicule, exile, and stubborn belief in the power of innovation. The transformation was complete by the summer of 1944. The funnies were no longer a British experiment. They were an Allied necessity. American and Canadian engineers began designing their own variants, adapting Hobart's principles to new challenges. The 79th Armored Division became the most specialized and versatile engineering force in military history, its reputation spreading across the front lines and into the halls of command. Field Marshal Montgomery, never one to give praise lightly, sent Hobart a personal note on July 18, 1944. "Your funnies have proven themselves beyond any doubt. British and Canadian forces have advanced with lower casualties than any amphibious operation in history, largely due to your innovations. The Army owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Well done, Percy. For Hobart, it was a moment of quiet satisfaction, but also a reminder that the work was never finished. Every new obstacle demanded a new solution, and every new solution was a chance to save more lives. As the Allies advanced into Germany, the funnies continued to lead the way. The crossing of the Rhine, the breaching of the Siegfried Line, the liberation of cities and towns, all were made possible by the relentless drive to innovate. Hobart's influence spread beyond Britain. American, Canadian, French, and other Allied forces all adopted specialized armored engineering vehicles based on his designs. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces developed extensive specialized armor forces, all traceable to the principles Hobart had pioneered. After the war, military theorists recognized that Hobart had created an entirely new category of warfare, specialized armor engineering. He had shown that tanks didn't have to be just weapons. They could be tools, each designed for a specific task. The principle he had proven was simple, but profound. Impossible problems become solvable when you refuse to accept that they can't be solved. Perhaps Hobart's greatest legacy was not any single vehicle, but the mindset he inspired. He taught a generation of soldiers and engineers to question everything, to challenge authority, and to believe that the craziest ideas might just be the ones that change the world. His story became a touchstone for innovators everywhere, a reminder that genius is often uncomfortable, that visionaries are rarely easy to work with, and that the price of ignoring new ideas can be measured in lives lost. The funnies, once mocked as impractical, now sit in military museums around the world. At the Tank Museum in Bovington, England, an entire hall is dedicated to Hobart's inventions. The vehicles look as strange now as they did in 1944. Tanks with spinning chains, floating screens, and massive bundles of wood. But the plaque beneath them says it all. These vehicles were mocked when first proposed. They were called impractical, impossible, and insane. They saved thousands of lives. For Percy Hobart, the journey from exile to vindication was a testament to the power of stubbornness, imagination, and the refusal to accept defeat. He had been right all along, not just a little right, but completely, comprehensively right. And as the world moved forward, the lesson of the funnies would echo through every new challenge, every new invention, and every new generation of soldiers who dared to think differently. But for Hobart, the real reward was not in the medals or the museums. It was in the quiet knowledge that, when the world needed him most, he had refused to give up. He had turned exile into opportunity, ridicule into revolution, and the impossible into reality. And in doing so, he had changed the course of history, not just for a day, but for generations to come. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world was left to count the cost and the survivors. For Percy Hobart, the end of World War II was not a moment of triumph, but of quiet vindication. The man who had once been forced into retirement, who had spent years as a farm guard and an outcast, now stood recognized as one of the war's most important innovators. Yet, true to his nature, Hobart never sought the spotlight. His satisfaction came not from medals or parades, but from the knowledge that his stubborn refusal to accept impossible had saved thousands of lives. In 1946, Hobart retired from the British Army for the final time, this time with honor rather than disgrace. He was promoted to Major General, later receiving the honorary rank of Lieutenant General. The awards and honors followed the American Legion of Merit, British knighthood, and the gratitude of countless soldiers whose lives had been spared by his inventions. But for Hobart, these were just tokens. The real reward was the legacy he left behind, a legacy not of machines but of mindset. He spent his post-war years quietly in Gloucestershire, the same countryside where he had once sketched his mad ideas in exile. The irony was not lost on him. I went from farm guard to general and back to the farm," he joked to friends. "But at least now they know I was right about the tanks." He maintained correspondence with soldiers who had served under him, and with the men whose lives his vehicles had saved. Letters poured in from across the world, some from grateful veterans, others from young engineers inspired by his story. One letter sent in 1953 by an American veteran moved Hobart deeply. "Dear General Hobart, I hope this letter finds you well. I was at Omaha Beach on D-Day. It was hell. Later, I heard about how the British beaches went, how they had these special tanks that cleared obstacles. I thought, why didn't we have those? Then I learned we'd been offered them and refused. Sir, I don't know how many of my buddies would still be alive if we'd used your tanks. All I know is I think about them every day. Thank you for trying to give us those tools even though we were too stubborn to take them. You were right and we should have listened. Respectfully, John Stevens, formerly PVT, 116th Infantry Regiment." Hobart kept that letter framed in his study for the rest of his life. But Hobart's influence didn't end with the war. He became a mentor to a new generation of military innovators, many of whom had served with the 79th Armoured Division and would go on to shape the post-war British Army. He lectured at military colleges, wrote technical manuals on specialized armored vehicles, and produced memoirs analyzing the lessons of World War II. His writings became foundational texts for military engineers and theorists, not just in Britain, but across NATO and beyond. Perhaps most importantly, Hobart never stopped warning against complacency. "The next war will have different problems," he told young officers in 1948. "The solutions that worked in this war won't necessarily work in the next. The important lesson isn't build swimming tanks or build flail tanks. The lesson is identify the specific problems you'll face. Refuse to accept that they're unsolvable and design specific tools to solve them." That principle never becomes obsolete. His ideas spread far beyond Britain. American, Canadian, French, and other NATO militaries all adopted specialized armored engineering vehicles based on Hobart's designs. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces developed extensive specialized armor forces, all traceable to the principles Hobart had pioneered. The concept of combat engineering, using machines to solve battlefield problems, became a cornerstone of modern military doctrine. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Hobart's funnies is not found in steel and fire, but in the lives they saved. Conservative estimates suggest that Hobart's innovations prevented 15,000 to 20,000 Allied casualties in the European theater. Every one of those soldiers who came home instead of dying, who had families, who built post-war lives. They existed partly because Percy Hobart refused to accept that beach assaults had to be suicidal. The numbers are staggering, but the real impact is personal. Behind every statistic is a story, a father who came home, a son who survived, a family that was spared the grief of loss. Sergeant Thomas Grant, the British tank commander, whose flail tank cleared a minefield in minutes instead of hours, lived to see his children grow up. Private William Murphy, the American who wrote to thank the genius who built the flail tank, survived the war and built a life he never thought he'd have. These are the true medals of Percy Hobart, the lives that continued because he refused to give up on his ideas. Yet, for all his achievements, Hobart remained a difficult, uncompromising figure. He was never easy to work with, never content to accept good enough, and never afraid to challenge authority. He was abrasive, stubborn, and often infuriating to those around him, but he was also brilliant, visionary, and, most importantly, right? The British beaches on D-Day succeeded with relatively light casualties, largely because one stubborn old man refused to retire quietly and instead spent years designing weird tanks in a farmhouse office. The American beach at Omaha suffered heavily, partly because those same innovations were refused. History has a way of vindicating visionaries, even when contemporary opinion dismisses them. Percy Hobart was vindicated not by awards or promotions, but by the simple fact that his innovations worked exactly as he said they would, saved lives exactly as he predicted, and proved that impossible is often just another word for nobody's tried hard enough yet. Today, when military engineers design specialized equipment, when innovators propose unconventional solutions, when someone is dismissed as crazy for thinking differently, people sometimes invoke Hobart's example. Remember Hobart's funnies. They say, they looked insane, they saved D-Day. That's not a bad legacy for a man who was twice forced into retirement, who worked as a farm guard, and who spent years being told his ideas were mad. He was right. They were wrong. And thousands of soldiers came home because of it. The Tank Museum in Bovington, England, now houses an entire hall dedicated to Hobart's inventions. The vehicles look as strange now as they did in 1944. Tanks with spinning chain drums, floating canvas screens, and enormous bundles of wood. They look funny, but they worked. One display has a simple plaque. These vehicles were mocked when first proposed. They were called impractical, impossible, and insane. They saved thousands of lives. The lesson: listen to the crazy people. Sometimes they're the only ones who see solutions everyone else misses. Hobart died in 1957 at the age of 71. His funeral was attended by former soldiers, military leaders, and engineers whose work continued his legacy. Field Marshal Montgomery gave the eulogy, calling Hobart one of the great unsung heroes of the war, a man whose innovations saved thousands of lives, but who received a fraction of the recognition he deserved. But Hobart's true legacy wasn't awards or recognition. It was the principle he'd proven and the lives he'd saved. So what is the lesson of Percy Hobart? It's not just about tanks or even about war. It's about the power of refusing to accept limitations. It's about the courage to challenge the status quo, to keep working in the face of ridicule, and to believe in your vision even when everyone else calls you mad. It's about the lives that can be saved, the futures that can be built, when someone dares to ask, what if we tried something different? The next time you hear an idea that sounds impossible, remember the man who built tanks that could swim, burn, and bridge the unthinkable, and proved everyone wrong. Remember that sometimes the difference between life and death, victory and disaster, comes down to a single question: are you willing to listen to the crazy ones? Because in the end, the world doesn't change because of those who play it safe. It changes because of those who refuse to accept that it can't be done. Percy Hobart was one of those people. And because of him, Thousands of men came home who might otherwise have died. That is the true legacy of D, Day's forgotten hero.